A man came home from war carrying a promise he could no longer keep. The woman he loved belonged to another. Some losses cannot be undone. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe. The boy who would become a scout learned to read the land before he learned to read the faces of men. His grandfather took him into the hills when the snow still held to the shadowed places, and showed him how to find water by watching where the deer walked at dawn. He learned to move through timber without breaking branches, to understand weather by the way smoke rose from cooking fires, to know when winter would come early by studying the thickness of animal fur in late summer. His people lived in a valley where 3 rivers met, and the land provided what they needed if they were patient and respectful. The valley stretched wide between mountain ranges that held snow most of the year. In spring, meltwater turned the rivers fast and high, flooding the lowlands and leaving rich soil when the waters receded. In summer, the sun warmed the ground enough for corn and squash and beans. In autumn, the harvest filled storehouses and root cellars. In winter, when storms locked the mountains in ice, the people stayed close to their fires and told stories that kept the old knowledge alive. The scout grew tall and lean, with hands that knew how to work and eyes that saw what others missed. By the time he reached 15 winters, he could track an elk through timber for 3 days without losing the trail. He could start a fire in rain. He could find his way home in darkness by reading stars and wind and the shape of land beneath his feet. He did not speak often, but when he did, the elders listened. His father had been a hunter of great skill before age stiffened his joints and dimmed his vision. His mother was known for her work with herbs and healing, for knowing which plants could draw poison from wounds and which could ease pain. His younger sister showed signs of the same gift, watching their mother with careful attention, learning which roots to gather in spring and which barks to strip in autumn. The girl he loved had been part of his world since childhood. Her family lived near his own, close enough that their mothers shared work and their fathers hunted together. Her name was spoken often in his hearing, but he held it privately, as something precious that did not need to be announced. She was 2 years younger, quick with her hands and quicker with understanding. She could tan a hide until it was soft as cloth, could gather roots that would sustain a family through hard months, could read the sky, and know when to bring the drying meat inside before rain came. Her father was a maker of tools, skilled with stone and bone and wood. He crafted arrow points that flew true and knives that held their edge. Her mother wove baskets so tight they could carry water. Her older brother had died young from a fever that swept through the village one winter, and after that, her parents held her closer, watched her with the careful attention of people who understood loss. The scout and the girl grew up working side by side during harvest times, during the seasons when everyone labored together. She helped her mother with gathering while he helped his father with hunting, but their paths crossed often enough that they learned each other's rhythms. There was no single moment when friendship became something else. It happened gradually, like a river changing course over many years. By the time he was 20 winters old and she was 18, everyone understood they would marry when the time was right. He spent a full moon carving the bird from antler. He worked on it during evenings after the day's labor was finished, sitting by firelight and using the smallest, sharpest tools his hands could manage. He wanted it to be perfect, wanted it to capture the shape of flight, the promise of return. When it was finished, smooth and white, and no larger than his thumb, he gave it to her during the spring gathering, when families came together to celebrate the end of winter. She took it without speaking, turned it over in her palm, ran her finger along the carved wings. Then she looked at him with eyes that held everything words could not express, and placed it in the small pouch she wore at her waist. That was their promise, unspoken but understood by everyone who saw the exchange. Her father nodded his approval. Her mother smiled. His own parents made quiet preparations for the wedding that would come when another year had passed, when he had proven himself further as a provider, and she had accumulated the household goods a new family would need. Then the war came. It arrived not as an enemy force, but as a request from men in uniform who spoke of alliances and threats from distant places. They came in late summer, when the harvest was beginning and everyone was occupied with bringing in crops. They wore blue coats and carried papers with official seals, and they spoke to the council about duty and protection and the greater good. They needed scouts who knew the land, who could move unseen and survive where others would perish. They spoke of protecting the people, of ensuring the valley would remain safe when the fighting ended, of honor and duty and the respect that came from serving the greater cause. They promised pay and provisions for families. They promised that service would be remembered when treaties were negotiated and boundaries were drawn. The council met for 3 days. The men in uniform waited at the edge of the village, patient and confident. They had made these requests before, in other valleys, among other peoples. They knew how to speak of threats without making direct accusations, how to offer protection that sounded like friendship but felt like coercion. Some of the elders argued they should refuse, that this war belonged to others and would bring only suffering to those who participated. The oldest among them remembered other conflicts, other promises made by men in uniforms, other young men who had left and never returned. They spoke of the danger in being drawn into disputes that had nothing to do with their own survival. Others said refusing would bring worse consequences, that cooperation might earn them protection and respect when the fighting ended, that showing willingness to serve might be remembered favorably when land and resources were being divided among the victorious. They pointed out that the men in uniforms had the power to make life difficult for those who did not cooperate, had ways of restricting trade and access to goods the valley needed. The discussions went late into each night, voices rising and falling like wind through grass. The scout attended these meetings, sitting in the back with other young men, listening to the arguments and counter-arguments, feeling the weight of a decision that would affect all of them. In the end, 6 young men volunteered. The scout was among them. He did not want to go, but he understood what refusal might mean for his people. The men in uniform had made certain promises, but their eyes suggested those promises could be withdrawn as easily as they were offered. He thought about his family, about the girl he loved, about the life he was building in this valley. He thought about what service might protect and what refusal might endanger. The night before he left, he walked with the girl along the river. The water ran high with spring melt, cold and fast over smooth stones. Late summer had been dry, but the snow in the mountains had been heavy the winter before, and the runoff still kept the rivers full. They walked without speaking for a long time, following a path they had walked many times before, their feet knowing the way without thought. When they reached the place where the 3 rivers came together, where the water formed a wide pool before continuing downstream, she stopped and turned to face him. The last light of day caught the water and turned it gold. She reached into her pouch and withdrew the carved bird. She held it out to him and told him to carry it, to remember why he was coming home. She said it would protect him, would remind him of what waited, would bring him back safely. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly when she placed the carving in his palm. He closed his fingers around it and promised he would return before the leaves changed color twice. 1 year, 2 autumns. Then he would be home and they would marry and begin the life they had planned. He believed it when he said it. She believed it when she heard it. Neither of them understood how war could stretch time, could turn months into years, could transform promises into memories. They did not embrace. That was not their way, not in public places where others might see. But they stood close enough that he could smell the sage she used to scent her hair, close enough that he could see the way the fading light caught the small scar on her cheek from a childhood accident, close enough that he would carry this moment with him through everything that came after. Then she turned and walked back toward the village, and he stood by the river until full darkness came, and the stars emerged overhead, bright and cold and distant. The men in uniform took the 6 volunteers east the next morning. They traveled on horses the scout and his companions were not accustomed to riding. The first days were difficult, learning to move with animals instead of on their own feet, learning to endure the soreness that came from long hours in the saddle. But they adapted, as they had been taught to adapt to all things. They traveled for 2 weeks before reaching the fort, where they would receive their training and assignments. The land changed as they moved east, becoming flatter, more open, marked by settlements and farms and towns the scout had never imagined. He saw more people in those 2 weeks than he had seen in his entire life before. The fort was a sprawling collection of wooden buildings surrounded by walls made of logs sharpened to points. Hundreds of men in uniform moved through the compound, engaged in drills and training and the endless routines of military life. The 6 scouts were assigned to a barracks with other indigenous men who had been recruited from different regions, speaking different languages, carrying different customs, but united by their skills and their displacement. The training was harsh but not impossible. The scout and his companions already knew how to track and hunt and survive. What they had to learn was how to function within military structure, how to take orders without question, how to move as part of a unit rather than as individuals. They learned to recognize ranks and protocols. They learned which officers could be trusted and which were dangerous. They learned that their skills were valued, but their opinions were not. After 6 weeks of training, they were assigned to different units based on where their particular knowledge would be most useful. The scout was sent west, to territory that resembled his homeland in topography, if not in detail. He became a guide for patrols moving through mountain passes and forests, leading men who would have been lost without him, keeping them alive through terrain that could kill the unprepared. The war was nothing like what the recruiters had described. It was not about honor or protection. It was mud and exhaustion, and watching men die from wounds that festered, from sickness that spread through camps, from bullets that found them in moments when they thought they were safe. The scout learned to survive by becoming even more invisible than before, by trusting his instincts when officers gave orders that made no sense, by enduring when endurance seemed impossible. He served as a guide through territories that reminded him of home but were not home. The mountains had similar shapes but different trees. The rivers ran clear but tasted wrong. The stars were the same, but he saw them from unfamiliar ground. He led patrols through passes where snow came early and stayed late. He found water sources in dry country. He read signs of enemy movement and kept his unit from walking into ambushes that would have killed them all. The officers learned to trust his judgment. The men in his unit began to defer to him on matters of terrain and movement, understanding that his knowledge kept them breathing. He was good at what they asked him to do, and that made them keep him longer than they had promised. The first year passed. Autumn came and went in the war zone, marked by falling leaves and early snow in the high country. The scout thought about the promise he had made, about returning before 2 autumns had passed. He thought about the girl waiting for him, about the wedding that should have been planned by now. But the fighting continued, and his unit was sent into winter operations, pursuing enemy forces through mountains where cold killed as efficiently as bullets. Winter was brutal that year. The scout had known cold in his home valley, but this was different. The cold in the war zone came with inadequate shelter and insufficient food and the constant stress of potential attack. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Some lost their minds, breaking under the combined weight of cold and fear and exhaustion. The scout endured by retreating into the discipline his grandfather had taught him, by treating each day as a problem to be solved, by focusing on immediate survival rather than distant hopes. When spring finally came, the fighting intensified. The winter stalemate broke and armies moved across thawing ground, clashing in battles that accomplished little but killed many. The scout led his unit through campaign after campaign, always moving, rarely resting, existing in a state of constant alertness that became his new normal. He wrote letters when he could, short messages that said little except that he was alive and thinking of home. The words felt inadequate, incapable of conveying the reality of where he was or what he had become. He sent 3 letters during that first year, addressed to his family with the understanding that they would share news with the girl and her family. He received 1 letter in return, delayed by months and delivered to a temporary camp where his unit was resting between operations. The paper was worn from handling, the writing careful and deliberate. His mother's hand, he recognized, probably dictated by several family members. They told him the harvest had been good. They said his father's joints were stiff, but he still hunted when weather allowed. They mentioned his sister was learning more about healing plants. They said everyone prayed for his safe return. There was no direct mention of the girl, but the letter included a line from his mother, saying that all the families continued well, and that spring had brought new growth to the valley. He understood this to mean the girl was waiting, that the promise held, that life continued in the patterns he remembered. He carried that letter until it began to fall apart, reading it so many times he memorized every word. When it finally disintegrated beyond reading, he kept the fragments in the pouch with the carved bird, 2 pieces of home that he could touch when darkness felt too heavy. The second year was harder than the first. The initial shock of war had worn off, replaced by grinding familiarity. The scout knew what to expect now, which made it worse in some ways. There were no illusions left, no naive hopes that the fighting would end quickly, or that his service would make any real difference in the larger conflict. He was simply a tool being used by forces that did not care about him or his people, surviving because his skills were valuable, and dying would serve no purpose. He learned to sleep through artillery fire. He learned to eat whatever food was available without tasting it. He learned to watch men die and keep moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking led nowhere useful. He became efficient and cold and effective, everything the army needed him to be. During the second autumn, his unit was sent into territory held by enemy forces, tasked with reconnaissance and harassment. They spent weeks moving through hostile country, avoiding main forces, gathering information, surviving on what they could hunt or steal. The scout kept them alive through superior knowledge of terrain and movement, finding paths that kept them out of sight and routes that led to safety when pursuit came too close. It was during this operation that he took his first kill in close combat. They had been discovered by an enemy patrol and fighting became inevitable. The scout moved with the instincts his grandfather had taught him for hunting, but applied now to hunting men. The experience left him hollow, not with guilt, but with recognition of how easily he had crossed a line he had once thought would be difficult. After that, killing became easier. Not because he enjoyed it or because it felt right, but because it was simply part of the work, no different from finding water or reading a trail. He understood he was becoming something different from the person who had left the valley. He wondered if the girl would recognize him when he returned, wondered if he would recognize himself. The second winter brought new horrors. His unit was trapped behind enemy lines for 3 weeks, surviving in conditions that tested every skill the scout possessed. They moved only at night, hid during the day, ate roots and bark, and once, when desperation demanded it, a dog they found abandoned near a burned farmhouse. 4 men died during those weeks, 2 from wounds that could not be treated, and 2 from cold that could not be escaped. When they finally broke through enemy lines and rejoined friendly forces, the scout weighed 20 pounds less than he had at the start of winter. His body had consumed itself to stay alive. His face had aged beyond his years. But he could still walk, still think, still function, and that made him more fortunate than many. The third year began with a different kind of assignment. The scout's reputation had spread among the officers, and he was pulled from his unit to serve as a guide for a special operations group tasked with deep reconnaissance missions. These operations took him into remote territories where regular forces never went, gathering intelligence that would shape larger strategies he would never see implemented. He worked with different men on each mission, soldiers chosen for specific skills and dispositions. Some were competent and respectful. Others were cruel and careless, and the scout learned to work around them without direct confrontation. He spoke less during this period, conserving words the way he conserved energy, offering only what was necessary to keep missions successful and himself alive. It was during one of these deep reconnaissance missions that he took the bullet that would change everything. They had penetrated far into enemy territory, observing troop movements and supply routes, when they were discovered by a patrol that should not have been in that area. The firefight was brief, but intense. The scout took a round through his left shoulder as they broke contact and fled into heavy timber. The bullet entered from the front and exited through the back, missing bone but tearing through muscle and leaving his arm weak and barely functional. One of the other soldiers bound the wound tight enough to slow the bleeding, and they moved through the night, putting distance between themselves and pursuit. The scout stayed conscious through force of will, knowing that losing consciousness meant being left behind, and being left behind meant death. They reached friendly lines 3 days later. By then, infection had set in and fever had taken hold. The scout remembered little of the next weeks, only fragments of being moved from place to place, of doctors working on his shoulder, of nights when fever dreams brought him visions of home that felt more real than the hospital tent where his body fought to survive. He spent 2 months recovering in a field hospital where men screamed at night and many did not wake up in the morning. The doctors saved his arm, but could not restore full strength to the damaged muscles. He regained most of his range of motion, but the shoulder would never be the same, would ache in cold weather and tire quickly under strain. The doctor who discharged him said he was fortunate that many men lost arms entirely from similar wounds. The scout did not feel fortunate. He felt diminished, marked, changed in ways that went beyond the physical damage. While recovering, he had time to think, and thinking brought home to him how long he had been gone and how much time had passed. 3 years, 6 seasons. The promise to return before 2 autumns had long since been broken. He thought about the girl waiting for him, wondered if she was still waiting, wondered what his absence had meant to her and her family. He thought about writing another letter but could not find words adequate to the distance that had grown between the person he had been and the person he had become. When he could travel again, they sent him back to his unit. By then, the war had shifted to new territory, and the fighting dragged on with no end in sight. The scout resumed his duties as a guide, working with his injured shoulder and compensating for its weakness through careful management of his movements. He was still effective, still valuable, but he knew his limitations now in ways he had not before. The 3rd autumn came and went. Then the 4th winter, harsh and long and filled with the same patterns of survival and endurance that had defined all the others. The scout stopped counting days and started counting only the things necessary to stay alive: food, water, shelter. The future had contracted to the immediate present, and that was somehow easier to bear than thinking about time passing and promises breaking. During the 4th year, the nature of the fighting changed. It became less about territory and more about exhaustion, both sides grinding against each other without clear objective beyond continuing to exist. The scout led patrols through the same areas he had traversed years before, reading trails he had read before, seeing ghosts of previous campaigns in the landscape. He was numb by then, operating on reflex and training, his emotions buried so deep he was not sure he could find them if he tried. He followed orders, completed missions, kept men alive when possible, and moved forward because moving forward was all there was left to do. The 4th autumn arrived with a rumor that peace negotiations had begun. The scout heard this news and felt nothing. He had heard similar rumors before, had watched them dissolve into continued fighting, and had learned not to invest hope in possibilities that might never materialize. But this time, the rumors were true. The war finally ended not with victory or defeat, but with exhaustion on all sides and agreements signed by men far from any battlefield. Treaties were negotiated in distant cities by people who had never heard a bullet whistle past their heads, who had never watched friends die for ground that would be abandoned a week later, who had never understood what they were asking of the men they sent to fight. The scout and the other survivors were released, given papers that documented their service, and told they could go home. No ceremony, no recognition, just dismissal, and the understanding that they had served their purpose and were no longer needed. The journey back took weeks. The scout traveled with 2 other men from his region, both changed by what they had seen. One had lost half his left foot to frostbite and walked with a permanent limp. The other had survived 3 bullet wounds and now flinched at sudden sounds. They did not talk much. There was nothing to say that would help. They simply moved together toward home, each locked in private reckoning with what they had endured and who they had become. They walked roads that were sometimes familiar, sometimes not, passing through towns that seemed untouched by war and others that bore its scars. They slept rough most nights, unwilling to spend their small remaining pay on lodging when the ground was free and they had slept in worse conditions. They hunted when game was available and bought food when it was not, eating mechanically and without pleasure. As they traveled west, the land began to resemble home more closely. The mountains took on familiar shapes. The air smelled right. The scout felt something stir in him that might have been anticipation or might have been dread. He was going home, but home was going to a person who no longer existed, carrying memories that could not be shared and wounds that could not be healed. When he finally saw the mountains that marked his valley, something loosened in his chest. The peak stood eternal and unchanging, indifferent to human struggles, marking home with geological certainty. He stopped on a ridge overlooking the approaches to the valley and stood for a long time, just looking, trying to reconcile the place he remembered with the place he now saw. Everything looked smaller than he remembered. The valley that had seemed vast in his youth now appeared contained and finite. The mountains that had been his whole world were just mountains, no different from dozens of other ranges he had crossed during the war. The rivers that met in the center of the valley were just water following gravity, not the sacred convergence he had built them into during years of absence. He realized then that he had been gone so long he had turned home into myth, and now myth had to become reality again, and that transformation would be painful. He descended into the valley alone. His 2 companions had separated days before, heading to their own homes in different directions. The scout walked the final miles by himself, following paths he had walked as a boy, seeing landmarks that held memories from before the war. He arrived in late autumn, when the leaves had already fallen and the first cold had settled into the ground. Smoke rose from cooking fires throughout the village. Children played in the last light of day. Women moved between homes carrying food and supplies. Men worked at evening tasks, securing animals and checking winter preparations. The scout walked through the edge of the village and people stopped to stare. Some recognized him immediately and called out greetings. Others looked uncertain, seeing a stranger who carried familiar features, but had changed in ways that made identification difficult. He nodded to those who greeted him but did not stop to talk, moving through the village toward his family's home with single-minded purpose. His family received him with quiet relief that held its own kind of pain. His mother wept when she saw him, touching his face as if to verify he was real, then pulling him into an embrace that he returned awkwardly, his body having forgotten how to accept comfort. His father gripped his hand and said nothing, which said everything. His eyes were wet, but he did not let tears fall, and the scout understood this as respect, as acknowledgement that some experiences left men beyond words. His younger sister, now nearly grown, looked at him as if he were a stranger. She had been 13 when he left and was now 17, transformed from girl to young woman in the years of his absence. She did not remember him well enough to mourn what he had been, only knew him as this hard-faced man with cold eyes who wore her brother's features, but was not the brother she dimly recalled. They fed him and gave him space to rest, and for 2 days he did not ask about the girl. He was afraid of the answer, though he did not know why. Some part of him already understood that time did not stop for promises, that 4 years was too long to wait, that life continued whether soldiers returned or not. He helped his father with small tasks, relearning the rhythms of home life. He sat with his mother and answered her questions about his health and his journey. Though he did not answer the questions, she did not ask about what he had seen and done during the war. He watched his sister work with herbs and healing plants, seeing how much she had learned in his absence, how capable she had become. On the third day, his sister told him about the girl. She did not mean to be cruel. She thought he already knew, thought someone must have written to him, thought he had come home understanding what he would find. The girl had married Thomas Birdsong 18 months earlier. Thomas was a good man, 10 years older than the scout, a widower with no children, whose first wife had died, giving birth to a stillborn son. The marriage had been arranged by the families through traditional protocols, negotiated and agreed upon with the participation of elders who witnessed the contracts. His sister said this plainly, not understanding how each word landed like a physical blow. She said Thomas treated the girl well. She said the marriage was considered fortunate for both families. She said everyone had been happy at the wedding. The scout felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with bullets or wounds. He felt the carved bird in his pouch, carried through 4 years of war, kept safe through everything, and understood it meant nothing now. The promise it represented had dissolved in time and distance, replaced by practical necessities he had not been present to address. He asked no questions. There was nothing to ask that would change what was. His sister offered no explanations beyond the basic facts, assuming he would seek details from others if he wanted them. She looked at him with sympathy, but also with the practical acceptance of someone who had watched life continue in his absence and had adjusted to realities he was only now confronting. The scout thanked her for telling him, then walked out of his family's home and kept walking until he reached the river. The water ran lower than it had in spring, clear and cold over smooth stones. He stood on the bank where he had stood with the girl the night before he left for war, and tried to remember what hope had felt like. The carved bird felt heavy in his palm when he took it out to look at it. 4 years of war had left it smooth and worn, marked by time and handling, but still recognizable as what it was meant to be. A promise, a future, a life that would never exist. He thought about throwing it in the water, about watching it disappear beneath the current and be carried away toward distant destinations he would never see. That would have been easy, would have been a clean ending to something that had already ended without his participation. But throwing it away felt like erasure, like denying that what he had felt had been real, like admitting that 4 years of carrying this small carving through hell had meant nothing at all. So instead, he put it back in his pouch and turned toward home, carrying a reminder of loss rather than discarding it, choosing to bear witness to what had been rather than pretend it had never existed. Over the following days, he learned the shape of his new life. He helped his father with work that needed doing, falling back into patterns of hunting and gathering and preparing for winter. The work was familiar but felt strange, too simple after years of survival under threat, too peaceful after years of violence. His hands remembered the skills, but his mind wandered, unable to settle into the quiet rhythms of home life. He sat with the elders and told them what they wanted to know about the war. He spoke carefully, choosing words that would give them information without burdening them with the full truth. He told them about terrain and tactics, about the armies and their movements, about the nature of the conflict in practical terms. He did not tell them about the screaming, about the smell, about the way men looked when they realized they were dying, about the things he had done to survive. The elders listened gravely and thanked him for his service. They said the valley had been fortunate that the young men who had gone to war had returned safely. The scout thought about the men who had not returned, who had died of wounds or disease or cold, whose families would never see them again. Safe return was relative, measured only by physical presence, not by what returning men carried inside them. He moved through the village and felt people watching him, wondering what he would do. They knew about the girl. They knew about Thomas Birdsong. They waited to see if there would be conflict, if the returned warrior would challenge the man who had married the woman promised to him. But the scout did nothing. He avoided the paths where he might encounter them. He turned away when he saw people who might bring news or gossip. He built walls around himself and functioned within them, existing in the village but separate from it, present but not participating. He saw her from a distance first, several days after learning of her marriage. She was carrying water from the stream, walking with another woman, both of them bearing full vessels balanced carefully. She moved the same way she always had, graceful and certain, her body knowing the work without conscious thought. She wore her hair differently now, in the style of married women, bound and covered in a way that declared her status to anyone who saw her. The scout stood in shadow between buildings and watched her pass. She did not see him. He made sure of that, stepping back when she turned his way, keeping himself hidden in a manner that had become second nature during the war. She walked past talking quietly with her companion, and he heard her voice, unchanged from memory, and felt something in his chest constrict. After she passed, he stood for a long time in the shadows, breathing carefully, trying to understand why seeing her hurt more than the bullet wound had hurt. Why this pain was somehow more difficult to endure than any physical injury he had sustained. The second time he saw her, she was working outside her home. Not her family's home where she had lived as a daughter, but the home she now shared with Thomas Birdsong, the place where she cooked and cleaned and built the life of a married woman. She was scraping a hide stretched on a frame, working the skin with practiced movements, preparing it for use in ways she had been taught since childhood. The scout was passing by on his way to help repair a roof on an elder's home, carrying tools and walking with several other men. He saw her before she saw him, and for a moment he thought he might pass without her noticing. But she looked up at the sound of footsteps, and their eyes met across the distance. She stopped working. Her hands went still on the scraping tool. Her face showed nothing he could read, no expression he could interpret. They looked at each other for a space of heartbeats that felt stretched and distorted, time moving wrong the way it had sometimes moved during combat, when everything slowed and sharpened and became too real. Then she looked down and resumed working, and he kept walking. Neither spoke. The other men with him glanced at each other but said nothing, understanding without explanation that something significant had passed, and that acknowledging it would serve no purpose. That evening, the scout's mother tried to speak with him about what had happened, about the girl's marriage and his return, and how he was managing the situation. He stopped her gently, telling her there was nothing to discuss, that what had been was past and what was now was present, and he had learned during the war that dwelling on what could not be changed only made survival harder. His mother looked at him with sorrow that had nothing to do with death, and everything to do with recognizing her son had become someone she did not fully know. She said nothing more about it, but he saw her worry in the way she watched him when she thought he was not paying attention, in the way she made sure he had food and comfort, in the small maternal gestures that could not heal, but could at least bear witness to pain. Thomas Birdsong was not cruel. That would have been easier to bear. He was steady and responsible, the kind of man who provided well and treated people fairly. The scout saw him working in the village, interacting with others, living a life that was unremarkable in its goodness. He was perhaps 40 winters old, still strong, still capable, with gray beginning to show in his hair and lines marking his face from years of smiling and squinting and living fully. He had lost his first wife 5 years earlier, and the grief had marked him but not broken him. He had continued working and contributing and being part of the community, but everyone had seen his loneliness, had understood he needed the partnership that made life full. When the girl's family had found themselves in need and the possibility of marriage had been raised, he had agreed not from predatory interest but from genuine desire to help and to ease his own solitude. The scout learned these things through overheard conversations and careful observation. He learned that Thomas was respected, that people trusted him to keep his word and honor his obligations. He learned that Thomas treated the girl with kindness, gave her a good home, provided well for her needs. There was nothing to hate him for, no cruelty to condemn, no injustice to rally against. That made everything worse. If Thomas had been cruel, the scout could have held on to anger, could have focused on protecting the girl from an abusive situation. But Thomas was simply a good man living a good life with a wife he treated well. And the scout was an outsider to that life, a shadow from a past that no longer mattered to anyone but himself. Winter came hard that year, arriving early and settling in with fierce cold and heavy snow. The scout spent long days cutting wood, hauling it to families who needed it, making sure his own family had sufficient fuel. He hunted when weather allowed, bringing back deer and elk that provided meat for multiple families. He worked until exhaustion took him, throwing himself into labor that left him too tired to think. His shoulder ached in the cold, a constant reminder of time lost and promises broken. The bullet wound had healed as well as it was going to, but cold weather made the damaged muscles stiff and painful. He worked through the pain, finding a kind of satisfaction in physical discomfort that at least had an identifiable cause and predictable nature. He spoke little during those winter months, becoming known as a quiet man who worked hard and kept his own counsel. People stopped trying to include him in gatherings and celebrations, understanding that he preferred isolation. Some saw this as grief he needed to process in his own time. Others saw it as damage from the war, wounds that were not visible but were no less real. Both interpretations were correct. Through careful avoidance, he managed to go weeks without seeing the girl directly. The village was large enough that different families moved in different patterns, and he learned her patterns and avoided them. He knew when she would be at the stream fetching water, when she would be at the gathering house participating in communal work, when she would be at her home tending to daily tasks. He arranged his own movements to minimize the chance of crossing paths, and mostly he succeeded. But the valley was small. Complete avoidance was temporary, not permanent. In midwinter, word spread through the village that the girl had lost a child in early pregnancy. The women spoke of it quietly, gathering in homes to support her, sharing knowledge about herbs that might ease physical pain and presents that might ease emotional suffering. The scout heard about it from his mother, who mentioned it while preparing a medicinal tea she would take to the girl's home. His mother did not watch his face when she spoke of it, giving him privacy in his reaction. She simply stated the fact and continued her work, grinding roots and measuring portions with practiced efficiency. The scout said nothing, asked no questions, and his mother did not expect him to. After she left to deliver the tea, he sat alone and thought about the child that had never been. A child that would have bound the girl to Thomas Birdsong in ways even marriage could not. A child that would have been proof of a life the scout had no part in. A child that was now just possibility lost, joining all the other losses that defined these years. He felt something that might have been grief, or might have been relief, or might have been both things tangled together until they could not be separated. He sat with this confusion until full darkness came, then rose and returned to his evening tasks, putting the information somewhere deep inside where it could exist without being examined. The girl recovered slowly from the loss. The scout heard this through fragments of conversation, through his mother's updates, and his sister's observations. She was strong, people said. She endured with dignity. Thomas supported her well through the difficulty. The women who knew about such things said she would carry other children when her body was ready. The scout absorbed these reports and continued his work, existing in the same village but moving through a different world, parallel to hers, but never intersecting. Winter deepened and the cold became severe, locking the valley in ice and snow. Work became survival-focused, each day about maintaining warmth and having enough food, about enduring until spring would return and the cycle could continue. During the coldest part of winter, when storms kept most people inside, the scout sometimes allowed himself to think about what might have been if he had returned as promised. 2 autumns, he had said. 2 seasons, then home and marriage and the beginning of their life together. If the war had ended when it was supposed to, if promises had been kept, if time had not stretched beyond bearing. But such thoughts led nowhere useful, so he disciplined himself to stop them. The war had taught him that survival required accepting reality without argument, adapting to what was rather than mourning what should have been. He applied these lessons to his current situation, treating his loss the same way he had treated battlefield losses, as facts to be acknowledged and moved past. Word reached the village in late winter that the girl was pregnant again. The announcement came through normal channels, shared among the women first, and then spreading to the whole community. She was past the dangerous early months this time, strong and healthy, carrying the child well. Thomas was pleased. The family celebrated as families do when new life is coming. The scout heard the news and felt nothing, which was somehow worse than feeling pain. He had become numb to the thing that had once defined his hopes, his capacity for that particular kind of hurt, exhausted by constant exposure. The carved bird remained in his pouch, but he stopped taking it out to look at it. Some objects were better left untouched, their weight enough reminder without needing visual confirmation. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, as if even the seasons were hesitant about change. The snow began to melt in late March, but cold nights kept refreezing what had melted during the day, creating cycles of thaw and freeze that made travel treacherous and work difficult. The rivers rose with runoff, swollen and dangerous, requiring care when crossing and respect when working near banks that could collapse without warning. The scout resumed hunting as the weather improved, moving into the high country where game had wintered and was now emerging from dens and sheltered valleys. He took long trips alone, sometimes staying out for a week or more, bringing back meat that he shared with his family and others who needed it. He preferred being away from the village, found the solitude of mountain forests easier to bear than the complex social navigation of community life. During one of these hunting trips in early May, he encountered a grizzly bear that had just emerged from hibernation. The bear was hungry and aggressive, defending territory it considered its own. The scout saw it before it charged, had time to prepare but not time to avoid conflict. He fired his rifle and wounded the bear, but did not kill it immediately, and the wounded animal attacked with the desperate violence of pain and rage. The fight lasted seconds but felt eternal. The scout used his knife when the rifle was knocked away, stabbing for vital areas while trying to protect his throat and belly from claws and teeth. He took damage across his ribs and thigh, deep cuts that bled freely, but he managed to drive the knife into the bear's heart and end the fight. He walked back to the village over 3 days, bleeding and fevered, surviving on will and skill. His mother and sister treated his wounds, stitching the worst of them and applying herbs to prevent infection. He recovered over several weeks, adding new scars to those he carried from the war, marking his body with evidence of survival. While recovering, lying on his sleeping pallet and drifting between waking and fever dreams, he heard his mother mention that the girl had given birth to a daughter. Mother and child were healthy. Thomas Birdsong was pleased to have a daughter to honor his first wife's memory. The family was celebrating. The scout heard this news from the border between sleep and consciousness, and it settled into him like water soaking into ground. The girl had moved fully into her new life now. She was a mother. She had created something that belonged to the future, not the past. The distance between what she was and what he remembered had become unmeasurable. When he finally recovered enough to resume work, summer had fully arrived. The valley was green and lush, crops growing in fields, animals fat on good grazing, the rivers running clear and moderate between spring flood and autumn low water. Life continued in its cycles, indifferent to individual sorrow, persistent in its patterns. The scout began to think seriously about leaving the valley, not immediately, but eventually. The thought brought neither excitement nor dread. It simply existed as an option, a path forward when staying felt like standing still. He had skills that were valuable in many places. He could guide traders, could hunt, could survive in territories that challenged others. There were opportunities elsewhere for a man willing to work and asking nothing but fair payment and being left alone. His mother sensed this intention without him speaking it, and she did not argue against it. She understood her son had become someone who did not fit comfortably in the place that had raised him, that war had changed him in ways that made peaceful valley life feel wrong. She grieved this privately but accepted it, knowing that demanding he stay would only increase his suffering. His father also understood and said nothing, but began teaching the scout additional skills that would serve him in different territories: navigation by stars and landmarks, negotiation with traders, assessment of animal sign in unfamiliar ecosystems. They spent evenings talking about distant places the father had traveled in his youth, sharing knowledge that might keep his son alive in country neither of them knew well. His sister asked once if he was leaving because of the girl, and he told her honestly that he was leaving because staying had no purpose. The girl was part of his past, not his present, and dwelling on what could not be changed served no one. His sister accepted this explanation but looked at him with sorrow, understanding that logic and emotion did not always align, that decisions made from necessity were not always decisions made from wholeness. Summer passed into autumn. The harvest was good again, the storehouses full, the community confident about surviving the approaching winter. The scout participated in harvest work alongside everyone else, moving through communal labor with practiced efficiency, contributing his share while maintaining the emotional distance that had become his default state. He saw the girl at the harvest gathering, helping to prepare food as all the women did. She moved among them with quiet efficiency, her daughter secured on her back in a cradleboard, the child's dark eyes watching everything with infant curiosity. The scout observed from a distance, noting how she had grown into motherhood, how she moved with the confidence of someone who knew her place and accepted it. He noticed how she sometimes paused to rest her hand on her belly, a gesture he remembered from women who carried children and understood she was pregnant again. The realization settled over him without surprise or pain, simply another fact about a life that had diverged completely from anything involving him. That child, and any children that followed, would bind her to Thomas Birdsong forever. Those children would be the future, and he was the past. The arithmetic was simple and unforgiving. He left the gathering early, before the dancing started, before the celebration reached its peak. He walked to the river and sat on the bank where they had walked the night before he left for war. The water whispered over stones, repeating sounds it had made for uncounted years, caring nothing for human promises or human grief. Stars emerged in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed his departure and now witnessed his acceptance. He understood then that some promises could not be kept, no matter how tightly you held them. He understood that love did not always mean possession, that caring for someone sometimes meant accepting they belonged to a life you were not part of. He understood that survival required moving forward, even when everything in you wanted to go back. The carved bird rested in his pouch, carried through war and homecoming and grief, proof that he had kept his promise, even when circumstances had made keeping it meaningless. He had returned. He had survived. He had honored what they had meant to each other. That would have to be enough. As autumn deepened and the leaves began to turn, the crisis came that would define everything that followed. It started with strangers arriving in the valley, men who claimed to represent the government that had sent the scout to war. They wore different uniforms than the soldiers had worn, suits of dark cloth that marked them as officials rather than fighters, but they carried the same kind of authority, the same assumption of power that did not need to be questioned. They brought papers and maps and demands. They gathered the council and spoke in formal language about new boundaries and relocated territories, about decisions made in distant cities by people who had never seen this land, about policies that would affect everyone in the valley regardless of their wishes or needs. The valley where 3 rivers met was valuable, they said. The land had strategic importance for future development. The water rights were needed for projects downstream. The territory would be better used for purposes that benefited the larger nation, not just the small community currently residing there. The people living in the valley would need to move. They would be relocated to territory set aside for such purposes, land that was less valuable and therefore available for indigenous settlement. The move would happen by the following autumn. That gave them nearly a year to prepare, to gather their possessions, to accept the inevitable. The officials spoke of compensation, of support during transition, of good faith efforts to make the relocation as smooth as possible. But their words held the hollow ring of promises made without intention to keep them, offers designed to appear generous while delivering minimal actual help. The elders met with these men and tried to negotiate, tried to appeal to the promises made during the war, tried to use reason and history and rights established through treaties and agreements. The scout had served in their war, they said. Other young men from the valley had served. They had been promised that cooperation would be remembered, that loyalty would be rewarded, that protecting the larger nation would mean protection for their own community. The officials smiled and spoke polite words that meant nothing. They acknowledged the service, praised the sacrifice, thanked the community for its contributions. But the decisions had been made at levels far above their authority. The timeline was set. The relocation would proceed. Opposition would only make the process more difficult. Some of the younger men wanted to resist, wanted to fight, wanted to refuse this theft of their homeland with violence if necessary. But the elders understood the math of resistance. They had few weapons and less training. The government had armies and resources beyond counting. Fighting would mean death, and death would serve nothing except pride. The council meetings went long into the nights, voices rising in anger and falling in despair, discussions cycling through options that grew fewer and more desperate with each passing day. The officials stayed at the edge of the village, patient and confident, waiting for acceptance to replace resistance, knowing that time and inevitability were on their side. Panic spread through the community. Where would they go? How would they survive displacement? What about the homes they had built, the fields they had cultivated, the graves of their ancestors? The officials had answers for none of these questions, or rather they had answers that amounted to indifference dressed in sympathetic language. The scout attended every council meeting, sitting in the back and listening, his mind turning through possibilities and finding nothing that offered real hope. He thought about the colonel he had served under, the man who had valued his guidance and owed him debts that had never been formally acknowledged, but were real nonetheless. He wondered if such debts could be called in, if personal obligation could overcome institutional indifference. During the third meeting, when discussions had devolved into desperation and the elders were grasping at increasingly unlikely solutions, one of them looked directly at the scout and asked if he had any contacts among the military men he had served with. Anyone who might intervene, or at least delay the process long enough for them to find alternatives. The scout thought about the officers he had known, the men who had valued his service but had never truly seen him as equal. He thought about promises made and broken, about honor that existed only in words, about the difference between owing someone and caring enough to pay that debt. But he also thought about the people in this valley, including a woman who had once been promised to him and children who would grow up displaced if nothing changed. He thought about his family, about the graves of his ancestors, about the land that had shaped him and still held him even when he planned to leave. He said he would try. The journey took him 3 weeks. He traveled east, retracing routes he had traveled during the war, seeking out men who might remember him and might care enough to help. He carried official papers documenting his service, letters of recommendation from officers who had valued his work, anything that might give him leverage in conversations that would require all the leverage he could gather. He found some men who had died, their service ended by bullets or disease or simply time. He found others who had moved on to civilian lives and wanted nothing to do with military matters or the complications of indigenous affairs. He found a few who remembered his name, but offered nothing more than sympathy, their power insufficient or their interest too shallow to translate into action. He traveled through territories that held memories of war, passing forts and battlefields and camps where he had spent miserable months surviving. The land looked different in peace, quieter and less threatening, but the memories remained sharp and immediate, triggered by familiar landmarks and the smell of certain trees and the way light fell across specific valleys. He finally located the colonel he had been seeking at a fort 300 miles from the valley. The man was now stationed there as garrison commander, promoted beyond field duty, comfortable in a position that offered respect and modest power. The scout arrived unannounced and requested a meeting, using his service record as introduction and his desperation as motivation. The colonel received him in an office that smelled of pipe tobacco and leather, surrounded by maps and papers that documented the administration of military territory. He was older than the scout remembered, grayer and heavier, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him effective in the field. He recognized the scout immediately, stood to shake his hand, offered him a seat, and asked what brought him so far from home. The scout explained the situation carefully, laying out the facts without exaggeration or emotional appeal. He spoke of the relocation order, of the timeline, of the community that would be displaced. He reminded the colonel of specific instances where his guidance had saved lives, operations that would have failed without his knowledge, debts that had been incurred if not formally acknowledged. He did not ask for charity. He asked for justice, for honoring promises that had been made, for recognizing that service should mean protection and loyalty should be reciprocated. He asked the colonel to make inquiries, to use whatever influence his position provided, to delay or modify orders that would destroy a community that had contributed young men to a war they had no stake in. The colonel listened without interrupting, his face revealing nothing. When the scout finished, the man was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his desk and seeming to weigh options against consequences, personal honor against institutional loyalty, what was right against what was possible. Then he looked up and said he would look into the matter. He made no promises beyond that. He said he would make some inquiries, would speak to people who might have influence, would see what could be done. He acknowledged the debt, said the scout service had indeed saved lives including his own, said that should count for something, even if the world did not always honor such debts. The meeting lasted less than an hour. When it ended, the scout had no certainty, but at least had hope, or if not hope, then at least the possibility of hope, which was more than he had brought to the meeting. The colonel walked him to the door and shook his hand again, told him he would send word if anything changed, wished him safe travel home. The scout left the fort and began the long journey back to the valley, carrying no answers, but at least having taken action. Having tried something when doing nothing felt like complicity in his own people's destruction. He traveled faster on the return, knowing that time mattered, that every day brought the community closer to the deadline and the officials closer to implementing their plans. He arrived back in the valley in early summer to find the situation unchanged. The officials were still present, still insisting on the autumn deadline, still deflecting arguments and ignoring appeals. But they had not yet taken any direct action beyond marking certain lands with stakes and making surveys that would inform future development. The scout reported his trip to the council, explained what he had done, acknowledged that he could promise nothing. The elders thanked him for his efforts, understanding that trying and failing was better than not trying at all, that even small chances were worth pursuing when the alternative was certain loss. The community existed in limbo through the summer, working their fields and living their lives while knowing everything might be torn away when autumn came. Some people began making quiet preparations for relocation, gathering portable possessions, and making plans for survival in unknown territories. Others refused to prepare, insisting they would not leave, that they would rather die on their own land than live displaced. The scout resumed his work in the valley, helping with harvest preparation and hunting and the endless tasks of community survival. He existed in the same uncertain limbo as everyone else, waiting for news that might not come, hoping for intervention that might not materialize, living day by day because that was the only way to live when the future was unclear. 2 weeks into summer, a messenger arrived with official papers bearing seals that indicated importance. The officials accepted the documents and read them in private, their faces showing nothing. Then they emerged and announced that the relocation had been postponed indefinitely, pending further review at higher levels of government. The specifics were deliberately vague, the language carefully constructed to promise nothing while providing temporary relief. No guarantees were offered. No permanent protection was established, but the immediate threat receded. The autumn deadline was suspended. The community could remain in their homes while matters were reviewed. The officials departed the next day, packing their surveys and maps and taking their demands with them. They left without apology or explanation, simply acknowledging that orders had changed and they were required elsewhere. The community watched them go with cautious celebration, understanding that reprieve was not the same as salvation, that the threat might return, but grateful for the breathing space. The valley celebrated that night with gathering and food and music, releasing tension that had built over months of uncertainty. The scout attended but stayed at the edges, accepting thanks from people who understood he had played a role in the postponement, deflecting praise he felt was premature given that nothing was permanently resolved. His role in the reprieve elevated his status in the community, transformed him from damaged veteran to respected leader, from isolated outsider to valued protector. People thanked him, praised his efforts, treated him as someone who had saved them from destruction. He accepted their gratitude with the same quiet reserve he had always shown, neither embracing the attention nor rejecting it, simply acknowledging that he had done what seemed necessary and fortune had favored the effort. She came to him 3 days after the officials left. He was working behind his family's home, repairing a section of fence that had weakened over winter when he saw her approaching. She walked alone across the open ground between homes, moving with purpose but without urgency, her daughter secured on her back in a cradleboard, the child's dark eyes watching everything with the solemn attention of the very young. The scout straightened from his work and waited, his heart beating harder than any physical labor could cause. He had not spoken directly to her since his return, had maintained careful distance for months, had existed in the same community while avoiding her presence. Now she was walking toward him deliberately, and he understood this meant something significant. She stopped a respectful distance away, perhaps 10 feet, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to maintain propriety. She wore simple working clothes, her hair bound in the style of married women, her body showing the changes that came from bearing and nursing children. She was still beautiful to him, still held his attention with the same magnetic pull she had always possessed, but she was also clearly someone else's wife, someone else's family, part of a life he had no claim to. When she spoke, her voice was steady but soft, carrying the weight of words carefully chosen. She thanked him for what he had done for the people, for the valley, for her family specifically. She said Thomas had told her they owed him a debt that could never be repaid, that he had saved not just their home, but the future of their children and the safety of everyone who lived in this place. The scout said it was nothing, that he had only done what anyone would do, that he could not stand by and watch his people be destroyed when there was any chance of preventing it. She shook her head slightly, a small gesture of disagreement. She said they both knew that was not true, that most men would not have made that journey, would not have called in debts from people who might have refused, would not have risked failure for a community that had given him mostly pain since his return. They stood in silence after that, and in that silence lived everything that could not be said. 4 years of war that had stolen time that could never be recovered. A promise broken by necessity rather than choice. A love that had never died but had nowhere to exist. A life she had built without him that was good and full and impossible to resent. A sacrifice he had made for a people that included her, motivated by duty, but also by caring that had never stopped. She reached into a pouch at her waist and withdrew something small. When she opened her palm, he saw the carved bird resting there, the antler smooth and yellowed with age, the shape still clear despite years of carrying. She held it out to him, offering it back, completing a circle that had begun the night before he left for war. She said she wanted him to know she had never forgotten. She wanted him to understand that some things did not change, even when everything else did. She said she carried him with her in ways that no one could see, that his place in her heart remained even though his place in her life could not. She wanted him to keep the carving, because it belonged to them both, and always would. because it represented something that had been real and remained real even though it could never be more than memory. He took the bird from her palm, their fingers not quite touching, the transfer accomplished with the careful distance of people who knew that contact would complicate what was already complicated enough. He looked at the small white carving, worn smooth by years of carrying, marked by time but unbroken, proof that something had existed and mattered even if it had not survived into the present. He told her he understood. He said he had never stopped caring, had never forgotten, had carried her memory through everything just as she had apparently carried his. He said he was glad she had found a good life, glad Thomas treated her well, glad her children would grow up safe in this valley that had been preserved. He meant these things even though they hurt to say. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and farewell and acceptance altogether. Then she turned and walked back toward the village, toward her home, toward the life that was hers now and would remain hers. He watched her go, the child on her back swaying gently with each step, until she disappeared from view behind other homes, and he was alone again with a carved bird, and a weight of memory that had no other outlet. That evening, he sat with the carving and thought about futures that could have been and futures that were. He thought about the difference between losing something and letting it go, between having love stolen and choosing to release it. He thought about love that lasted not because it was possessed, but because it was remembered, not because it demanded acknowledgement, but because it existed quietly beneath the surface of visible life. The carving felt warm in his palm, worn by years of handling, proof that he had kept his promise even when keeping it had become meaningless, that he had returned even when returning had brought only pain, that he had honored what they had been to each other, even when honor required distance rather than claim. The next morning, he began preparing for a journey north. Not to escape, but to build something new. The valley was safe for now, his people were secure, and his presence had served its purpose. Staying would only mean existing in the shadow of what could not be, and that served no one. He had skills that were valued elsewhere. He could guide, could hunt, could survive in territories that challenged others. He could build a life that was his own rather than a life haunted by someone else's happiness. His family understood, though his mother wept again. She had wept when he left for war, and she wept now when he was leaving for peace, understanding that either way she was losing her son to distance and circumstance. But she also understood he could not stay, that remaining in the valley would slowly destroy whatever parts of him had survived the war, that going was necessary even if it brought her grief. His father gave him supplies for the journey, provisions and tools and advice gathered from a lifetime of surviving in hard country. He shared knowledge about northern territories, about tribes who lived there and traders who traveled through, about opportunities for a man with the scout skills. He did not try to convince his son to stay, understanding that some decisions were already made and that arguing would only burden them both. His sister asked if he would return, and he said he did not know. Maybe, someday, when enough time had passed that the weight of the past felt lighter, when he had built enough of a new life that coming back would not feel like returning to a wound that never healed. She accepted this uncertainty and made him promise to send word occasionally, to let them know he was alive and surviving, to maintain connection even across distance. Before he left, he walked to the river one final time. The water ran clear and steady, eternal in its movement, always changing and always the same. He stood on the bank where he had stood with the girl the night before leaving for war, where he had stood again after learning of her marriage, where he had stood repeatedly when memories became too heavy to carry alone. He took out the carved bird and held it in his palm, feeling its weight, its smoothness, its silent testimony to promises made in youth. He thought about throwing it into the water, about releasing it to the current, and letting it be carried away to destinations unknown. That would have been symbolic, would have represented moving forward and releasing the past. But throwing it away felt like erasure, like denying what had been real, like admitting that the love they had shared meant nothing simply because it had not survived into the present. So instead he placed it back in his pouch close to his heart, understanding that carrying it was a choice, that keeping this weight was something he did deliberately rather than from inability to release it. He turned north as the sun was rising, walking away from the valley as light spread across the land. Behind him, the three rivers met and divided, water flowing from distant sources toward distant destinations, connected and separate, moving and still. The mountains rose eternal and indifferent, marking territory that would exist long after every human promise had been broken and forgotten. He walked trails that led away from everything familiar, following paths that would take him to new territories where he could build a life defined by present choices rather than past losses. His shoulder ached with the first miles, the old bullet wound making itself known as it always did when work began. He adjusted his pack and kept walking, accepting the pain as companion and reminder, part of who he was now and would remain. The journey north took weeks. He traveled alone through country that was sometimes populated and sometimes empty, following routes he learned from traders and trappers he encountered along the way. He worked for his passage, guiding groups through difficult terrain, hunting for camps that needed meat, using his skills to pay for information and provisions. He passed through territories held by different peoples, some welcoming and some suspicious, all navigating their own relationships with the expanding nation that had fought the war and now was spreading across the continent. He saw communities thriving and communities struggling, tribes that had adapted and tribes that had resisted, endless variations on survival in a world that was changing faster than tradition could accommodate. He found work eventually in mountain territory far north of his home valley, guiding traders through passes that were dangerous in good weather and deadly in bad. The traders valued his skills and paid fairly, asking no questions about his past and caring only that he kept them alive and helped them move their goods to markets that paid high prices for furs and minerals and other resources extracted from wilderness. He built a small shelter near a trading post, a single-room cabin that provided protection from weather and gave him a place to return between journeys. The cabin was crude but functional, built with his own hands from materials he gathered himself, representing security that depended on no one's goodwill but his own capability. He lived simply and quietly, working when work was available and surviving on savings when it was not. He spoke little and socialized less, becoming known as reliable but distant, skilled but isolated, someone people hired but did not befriend. This suited him fine. He had no desire for closeness, no energy for the complications of friendship, no interest in building connections that might demand more emotional engagement than he was capable of offering. The carved bird remained in his pouch, carried with him on every journey, present but unexamined, a weight he had chosen to bear and would continue bearing until death released him from the obligation. He took it out occasionally, usually on nights when he could not sleep, when memories became too insistent to ignore. He would hold it and think about the girl who was now a woman, about the life she was living that he would never see, about love that existed in memory rather than presence. Years passed. The scout grew older without softening, his body aging and his face marking with lines that came from weather and hardship rather than laughter. His hair showed gray. His hands developed the permanent calluses and deformities that came from endless work in cold conditions. He remained strong but recognized his strength was finite, that eventually age would take what youth had provided, that his body was a tool that would wear out with use. He never married. The traders sometimes asked if he wanted them to arrange introductions with women in settlements they visited, but he always declined. He had no room in his life for partnership, no capacity for the vulnerability that intimacy required. He was complete in his isolation, or if not complete, then at least functional, which was close enough to serve. He never returned to the valley. He sent occasional letters to his family, brief messages that confirmed he was alive and working, providing no details about his life beyond the minimum necessary to ease their worry. He received letters in return, irregular and delayed by the difficulties of delivering mail to remote territories, telling him about deaths and births and marriages and the slow changes that marked passing time. His mother died when he had been gone 8 years. The letter from his father was simple and direct, stating fact without elaboration. She had been ill for months, something in her chest that the healing knowledge could not cure. She had died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family. She had asked about him near the end, had hoped he was safe and well. His father thought he should know. The scout received this news in spring, sitting in his cabin while rain fell outside. He read the letter multiple times, trying to feel something appropriate to the loss, finding mostly numbness and a distant kind of regret that he had not been present for her final days. He had not seen his mother in years, had chosen distance over connection, and now that choice was permanent. She was gone, and he carried guilt for absence, but could not say what he should have done differently. He continued his work. Time passed. The world changed around him in ways large and small. The nation expanded and consolidated its control over territories that had once been contested or independent. Railroads spread across the continent, bringing trade and settlement and transformation. The indigenous peoples who had held the land for uncounted generations were systematically removed or restricted or destroyed, their ways of life becoming historical memory rather than present reality. The scout heard news of these changes through traders and travelers, stories of tribes relocated or eliminated, of valleys taken and communities scattered, of the slow grinding erasure of everything that had been before the nation decided it wanted the land. He thought about his own valley, about the reprieve he had won that was always meant to be temporary, about the certainty that eventually the officials would return and finish what they had started. He wondered if the valley still stood. He wondered if his father still lived there, if his sister had married and raised children, if the community continued in the patterns he remembered, or had been transformed by pressures he could not see from this distance. He wondered about the girl, though she was not a girl anymore, had not been for years, was now a woman with children who were themselves growing, living a life he could imagine only in the vaguest terms. He thought about returning, about walking back to see what remained, about closing the circle of his displacement and witnessing what had become of the place that had made him. But he never went. The journey was long and difficult. The welcome would be uncertain. The pain of seeing what had changed would outweigh any comfort of seeing what had remained. So he stayed in the north and worked and survived and carried his memories privately. In his 15th year away from the valley, on a clear autumn evening, much like the one when he had left for war so many years before, the scout sat outside his cabin and watched smoke rise from his small fire. The air was cold and still, the smoke rising straight into the darkening sky before dispersing in higher altitudes. Stars began to emerge one by one, ancient light traveling impossible distances to reach him. He took out the carved bird and held it, examining it in the firelight. The antler had yellowed further with age, taking on the deep patina that came from years of handling and exposure. The shape was still clear, the bird still recognizable, but time had worn the details softer, had smoothed the edges and gentled contours until the carving felt more like suggestion than representation. He thought about the girl who had become a woman he would never see again. He thought about the promise that had been broken by circumstance rather than choice. He thought about the love that had defined his youth and haunted his maturity, that had never died, but had nowhere to exist except in the private spaces of memory. He thought about sacrifice and survival, about the difference between what was wanted and what was possible, about the ways that love could endure through absence and distance, and the absolute impossibility of fulfillment. He had kept his promise in the only way that mattered, by returning and by releasing her, by honoring what they had been without destroying what she had become. The bird felt warm in his palm, heated by his hand and by the fire's proximity. He closed his fingers around it gently, as if holding something fragile and precious, which in every way that mattered, he was. This small carving represented everything he had loved and lost, everything he had been promised and denied, everything that had shaped him and marked him and made him who he was. In the valley where 3 rivers met, If the valley still stood, a woman lived her life with dignity and quiet strength. She had raised her daughter, and whatever other children had come, had cared for her husband, who was a good man, had tended her home and contributed to her community, and survived displacement or remained in place depending on what fortune had allowed. She had built a full life from the pieces available to her, had made something good from circumstances she had not chosen. She kept her own memories, held them close in a place where no one else could see. She remembered a young man who had promised to return and had returned too late, who had loved her enough to let her go, who had saved her valley from destruction, and then left rather than haunting her days with his presence. She remembered the carved bird she had given back to him, understanding that some things needed to be returned to their makers, that keeping it would have been cruel to them both. Sometimes, perhaps on nights when her family slept and the house was quiet, she touched the place over her heart where that carved bird had once rested in its pouch, and remembered a promise that had never truly been broken, only transformed into something else. She thought about the scout in whatever distant place he had gone, wondered if he still lived and still remembered, hoped he had found some measure of peace, even if peace was not the same as happiness. The distance between them was absolute and permanent. They would never see each other again, would never speak the words that had remained unspoken, would never touch or hold or share the life they had imagined in youth. But the connection remained, invisible and enduring, a thread that stretched across geography and time, binding them in memory, even as circumstance kept them forever apart. The scout sat in the darkness of the northern mountains, holding a carving that meant everything and nothing. The fire burned low, the cold deepened. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to human sorrow, marking time that moved in one direction only, carrying everything forward whether it wanted to go or not. He understood finally, after years of carrying this weight, that grief was not something to be resolved, but something to be inhabited. It was a room he lived in, familiar and unchanging, a constant presence that shaped his days without consuming them. He would carry the girl's memory until death released him from the obligation, would hold this carved bird until his hands could no longer hold anything, would honor what had been by accepting what was. Pain faded but never disappeared. Memory remained when presence could not, and in the end, that was enough. Not what he had wanted, not what he had dreamed during those years before the war when the future had seemed clear and full of promise, but enough to build a life upon, enough to survive with dignity, enough to honor what had been by accepting what was and would remain. The carved bird rested in his palm, small and white and enduring. A promise that had been kept in the only way possible, by two people who had loved each other enough to let that love exist in memory, rather than destroy lives in pursuit of something that could no longer be. A testament to youth and hope and all the things that war and time and necessity had transformed into something quieter but no less real. The world continued its turning. The stars moved through their courses, the fire collapsed into embers and ash, and the scout sat in the darkness of a life chosen from limited options, holding proof that he had once been promised something beautiful and had honored that promise even when honoring it meant release rather than possession. In the valley, if the valley still stood, the rivers continued their endless meeting and parting, water flowing from distant sources toward distant destinations, connected and separate, moving and still. The land endured, the seasons turned. Life continued in its patterns, marked by birth and death and all the small moments that accumulated into years and decades, and eventually into memory that outlasted the people who had lived it. The scout would die someday in these northern mountains, probably alone, probably while working, his body simply reaching its limit and stopping. Someone would find him eventually and bury him in ground that had not raised him, among people who had known his skills but not his history. The carved bird would be buried with him or lost, or given away to someone who would never understand its significance, becoming just an old carving, its meaning erased by the death of the person who had carried it. But before that ending, there were years still to live. Work to do, seasons to endure. The small satisfactions of competence and survival and being useful to the people who hired him. The quiet pleasure of mountain sunsets and the first snow of winter and the return of spring after months of cold. The simple fact of continuing, of existing, of making it through one more day and then another and another, building a life from persistence rather than joy. He would think of her sometimes, especially in autumn when the air held a certain quality that reminded him of that last evening before he left for war. He would remember her voice and her face and the way she moved, details that remained sharp even as years passed and other memories faded. He would touch the carved bird in his pouch and feel the weight of what had been, understanding that some loves were measured not in fulfillment, but in endurance, not in presence, but in the ache of absence. And perhaps she would think of him too, in whatever life she was living, whatever version of happiness or contentment or simple survival she had built from the pieces available to her. Perhaps she would remember the young man who had left for war carrying her promise, and returned to find that promise transformed into something else. Perhaps she would touch the place where his gift had rested and feel gratitude for his release, sorrow for his loss, and the complicated mixture of emotions that came from loving someone you could never have. The night grew deeper, the cold intensified. The scout finally stood and went inside his cabin, the carved bird secure in its pouch, the fire outside dying to ash. He laid down on his sleeping pallet and closed his eyes, not sleeping immediately but resting in the darkness, listening to the silence of the mountains, feeling the weight of his years and his memories and his continued survival. Tomorrow he would rise and work and eat and sleep, and the day after that would be the same, and the day after that. The pattern would continue until it could not continue anymore, until his body gave out or accident claimed him or old age finally brought the rest he had earned. And throughout all those days, he would carry what he had always carried, memories and regrets and the small carved bird that proved he had once been loved, had once loved in return, had once believed in futures that had not come to pass. But he had survived. Against odds that had killed many others, through war and displacement and grief that might have broken someone less determined, he had continued. That was its own kind of victory, not glorious but real, not what he had wanted, but what he had achieved. He was alive. He functioned. He contributed. He endured. The carved bird rested near his heart, separated from his skin by leather pouch and fabric shirt, but present nonetheless. A constant weight that had become so familiar he would feel its absence more clearly than he felt its presence. It was part of him now, integrated into his identity, as much a part of who he was as the scars on his body, or the coldness in his eyes, or the silence he wrapped around himself like armor. In the valley where three rivers met, if the valley still stood, the same stars that looked down on the scout in his northern cabin also looked down on a woman sleeping in her home, beside a husband who had given her security and children and a life that was not perfect but was hers. She dreamed sometimes of a young man who had left for war, who had promised to return, who had kept his promise even when keeping it brought only pain. She woke from these dreams with tears on her face and grief in her chest, emotions she kept private and processed alone, understanding that her waking life had no room for the love that lived in dreams. But the love remained. For both of them, across distance and years, and the absolute impossibility of fulfillment, the love remained. Not as it had been, not young and hopeful and full of promise, but as something harder and more enduring, tempered by loss and polished by time into something that could survive anything because it demanded nothing. It was enough. It had to be enough. There was no other option. The world had given them this and taken everything else, and they had adapted because adaptation was the price of survival, because continuing required accepting what could not be changed and building lives from whatever remained. The scout slept finally, his breathing steady and deep, his body at rest even if his heart never fully was. The night moved toward dawn. The stars traced their paths across the sky. The earth turned in its orbit, carrying everyone forward through time that could not be stopped or reversed, or made to wait for promises to be fulfilled. And somewhere in the darkness, in a valley or a relocation camp or wherever circumstance had carried her, a woman also slept, carrying memories that matched his own, bearing witness to love that had survived everything except the chance to exist in the world, holding in her private spaces the knowledge that she had been loved completely and had loved in return, that this had been real even though it had not been enough. Two lives forever changed by war and time and necessity. Two hearts still connected across distance. Two memories keeping alive what the world had killed. This was what remained. This was what endured. This was the price of survival and the cost of love in a world that cared nothing for promises made by young people who had not yet learned that wanting something was not the same as being able to have it. The carved bird rested in the darkness, proof and testament and reminder, small and white and enduring, holding in its shape everything that words could not express. Love and loss and loyalty and grief and the quiet dignity of continuing when everything inside screamed to stop. The full weight of a life lived in the shadow of what might have been, choosing every day to honor the past by living in the present, accepting what was while remembering what had been. This was the story. Not the one they would have chosen, but the one they received. Not the ending they had imagined when they stood by the river in their youth, but the ending that was real, and therefore the only one that mattered. They had loved. They had lost. They had survived. And in the surviving, they had proved that love could endure even when everything else fell away, that some connections ran too deep to be severed by mere circumstance, that the heart could hold what the life could not contain. The night passed. Dawn came. The scout rose and began another day, carrying what he had always carried, moving forward because forward was the only direction time allowed. And in the valley or wherever she was, the woman also rose and began her day, tending to her family and her work and her life, carrying her own weights and memories, surviving with the same quiet dignity that had always defined her. The world continued. The seasons turned. The years accumulated. And two people who had loved each other in youth carried that love through everything that came after, transformed but not destroyed, present even in absence, enduring in memory because memory was all they were allowed to keep.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.